Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm happy to welcome those of you who are joining us in person and those of you who are joining us online. The Massachusetts Historical Society is the first historical society in America. We date back to 1791. The Historical Society was founded early enough that our founder, Jeremy Belknap, wrote a letter to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere wrote back. So that's real breadth of history. We maintain a fantastic research library that holds about 14 million manuscript pages, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 US presidents, as well as mothers, protesters, poets, and artists. For the past 232 years, we've made this collection available to researchers, both academic and from the general public. We also host a wide variety of programs. So as you can see, we cover a wide spectrum of subjects. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you're a member, I'd like to thank you. If you're not, I'd like to encourage you to consider becoming a member or joining our community through a donation. This evening, we're happy to welcome Dr. Joshua Smith. He is a professor at the American Merchant Marine Academy and the director of the American Merchant Marine Museum. He earned his PhD in US and Canadian history from the University of Maine and his master's in maritime history and underwater archaeology from East Carolina University. He also holds degrees from the Maine Maritime Academy and the University of St. Andrews. He has published or edited numerous books on maritime history. This evening, he will be speaking about his book, Making Maine, Statehood in the War of 1812, which explores a war that is often overshadowed in American history, but helped to shape the new nation. This was a wildly unpopular war in many places, including Massachusetts, and certainly had a major impact on the people who lived in Maine, which at the time was a part of Massachusetts. I have to just sort of point out that following the program, you're welcome to check out the very early map of Maine we have on the wall. This was put together by Osgood Carleton, one of the first professional map makers in America around 1799, just a few years before he put together the map of Massachusetts, which is next to it. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Thank you for that introduction, Gavin. I'd like to start by saying I've spent a lot of pleasant hours in this building doing research for this project, which started, hard to believe, 30 years ago. It was a very different Massachusetts Historical Society back then, but always very supportive and has provided many kindnesses to me, past and present, including the current staff, but more especially Conrad Wright, who I understand isn't here tonight, but really was very good to me here. I'd also like to thank, far from Boston, the Border Historical Society in Eastport, Maine, which provided a generous subvention for this book. It's always nice to, the University of Massachusetts Press, likes to see those subventions come in these parlous times for publishers. I'm going to offer you a fairly lighthearted presentation tonight. But first, I'm going to tell you, you've all been ambushed. You may not realize it, but this date, March 15th, is a momentous one, although I doubt anybody here realizes it. On March 15th, 1820, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was rent in two as Maine officially became the 23rd state. So this is where the doors. It wasn't me. So why you're surprised is that this isn't a story that gets told a lot in Massachusetts. It may trouble many of you because Maine isn't supposed to influence Massachusetts, but it has in really significant ways. Consider Boston as the state capital. While virtually every other colony that revolted in 1775 ended up moving their state capital to the center of the state, Massachusetts retained its colonial capital. Now, this is despite the protest of Western farmers and rebels like Daniel Shays, if you remember Shays's rebellion, and others in Western Massachusetts who demanded in the 1780s that the Commonwealth's capital be moved to, I think we can add quel horror to this, what a horror, to Worcester. And you know, it's almost enough to make you drop your polar kohler, right? Which is the big product out of Worcester. And the Boston status quo had a very simple answer for Shays and his ilk. For starters, they shot them, they imprisoned them, and came close to hanging Shays and other leaders. But in more rational moments, the great and the good of Boston pointed out that Boston really was in the center of the Commonwealth if you took the District of Maine into account. Oh, tricky, right? Later on, it's not going to matter because Boston became the hub of the universe and Worcester did not. So what I'm suggesting tonight is that Maine's statehood was a rejection of what I call the Massachusetts ideal, which is a set of attitudes and prejudices prevalent in old Massachusetts that failed to take hold on the Maine frontier. In other words, Maine's statehood is an opportunity to examine the ideas that underlay the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, including its 1780 state constitution, which is still in force today, as I understand, and which largely sprung from the mind of John Adams. And I think you folks here at the Massachusetts Historical Society have a thing for John Adams. So, and I'm not exactly the first to traverse this territory. In 1969, James M. Banner Jr. published To the Hartford Convention, where he posits that people in Massachusetts, mostly Federalists, sought what he called harmony, unity, order, and solidarity. And he called this the myth of New England exclusiveness, which he described as, and I quote here, a kind of mental shorthand for a constellation of attitudes and ideals at whose core was the conviction that the people of New England, and none more so than Massachusetts, were somehow set apart from the rest of the nation. Oh, I bet there are a couple of people in this room who believe that now in 2023. And Banner picks up his ideas from writers like Henry Adams, who's I think the great-grandson of John Adams. I get my Adamses confused. But Henry Adams writes that Bostonians of the early republic were uninterested in becoming American in thought or feeling. Okay, so New Englanders are different, not same as other Americans. And this kind of backs us into dealing with John Adams again. John Adams was vainglorious about his native Massachusetts. He trumpeted it as a superior society that the world should emulate. In his estimation, which he repeated more than once in his diary, and to foreigners and Americans alike, Massachusetts and New England were better than the rest of the nation. Other New England writers, such as the educator Timothy Dwight and the geographer Jedediah Morse, validated his views. And his views come out in the Massachusetts State Constitution of 1780, which is an early state constitution, right? We're still fighting the American Revolution. And there are some interesting elements that come out in this. The first is that Massachusetts has an established Protestant church. That is to say, there is no separation of church and state. And in fact, this is fine even after the US Constitution goes into effect in 1789, because the separation of church and state clause in the Constitution actually only refers to the federal government. And several states had state-supported churches. Another element that's sort of odd is a focus on property rights enforced by the Massachusetts judiciary, which is not only conservative, but I think arguably reactionary. The great example of that is actually on that map of Maine over there, where you see all these nice, neat blocks where there were these imaginary towns being created in Maine, owned by land speculators who lived in Boston. And there were squatters up there who resisted this. This is Alan Taylor's work going back to the 1990s now, who said, no, we occupy the land, we should have it. But no, Massachusetts law not only quite clearly said it belonged to these speculators who bought up huge blocks of land, but oddly enough, it said that the speculators only had to pay a very low tax on the land, whereas the impoverished farmer, who's not a speculator, had to pay about 3 times the tax that the speculator did. Hey, folks, I'm here to tell you, it's a fixed game, okay? Here's another funny thing about property rights. And this, again, seems to come from the mind of John Adams. State senators in Massachusetts, there wasn't just 2 per county or whatnot, a set number per county. It was actually the counties got a number of senators apportioned by the assessed wealth of that county. If you live in Essex County or Suffolk County, you get a bunch of senators. If you live in Washington County in easternmost Maine, not so much, right? So it's all about protecting property rights and putting Boston at the center. Also unusual for an early state constitution, Massachusetts has an unusually strong executive power. That is to say, the governor actually has real powers. And Daniel Shays figures this out when the governor squashes his rebellion in the 1780s. So there's a lot going on with that constitution, and people in Maine may not like that so much. And then there's social elements to Massachusetts as well. Massachusetts has a social hierarchy, often reinforced by militia rank or, say, by attending Harvard or another college. And in old Massachusetts, you're supposed to listen to your superiors, right? They tell you how to vote, they take care of everything for you, you respect them, and it's all good. Those folks up in Maine, those squatters, again, no, deference isn't where they're coming from, nor is education, I might add, nor is the Congregational Church. Mainers have a lot of issues. So I think that ultimately that Banner, when he describes his, what I call the Massachusetts ideal, is actually too generous. I find that this Massachusetts ideal is actually about a handful of colonies, counties in eastern Massachusetts, Suffolk, Essex, etc. While much of western Massachusetts, the old Plymouth colony, including the Cape and Islands, and the counties in the District of Maine, reject the Massachusetts ideal. So how does the Massachusetts Standing Order respond to this? Well, these people, often referred to as the great and the good, dismissed its critics as uninformed, mediocre, hicks, heretics, and reserved the harshest term for the most dangerous. Those they deemed Jacobins, inferring a godless, violent revolutionary influenced by the French. There was nothing worse. The squatters, meanwhile, who settled in inland Maine, also merited special opprobrium, one observer calling them, and I quote, a people naturally bad and violent. Maine settlers, in response, took on the title of squatter as a badge of honor, not so different from Puritans in that sense, in that they take an epithet thrown at them and make it their own. And many people in Maine and others in Massachusetts oppose the Massachusetts ideal, and they see it not as what Banner described as order and all that good stuff, but they see it as oppression, censorship, and bigotry. And there are people outside of Massachusetts who aren't so keen on the Commonwealth's ideas either. We call them Virginians. And they ain't buying it. George Washington, on his arrival in Cambridge in 1775, described New England's Yankees as, quote, generally speaking, the most indifferent kind of people I ever saw, and exceedingly dirty and nasty people. He got over it, and a lot of his leading generals were from Massachusetts, but I think that gives you an idea. Now, Thomas Jefferson, who people in Massachusetts generally did not care for, maybe because he was a ginger, I don't know. But he was pretty disgusted by what he saw as the bumptious sectionalism of the Commonwealth, writing, Massachusetts would really be great if she did not think herself the whole. That could be 2023. So when New Englanders, Yankees, whatever you want to call them, differ with the Massachusetts ideal and buy into the Virginian idea of what America should be, which is much more egalitarian, much more separation of church and state, small government, they're called apostates. And probably the foremost of these is a guy named Henry Dearborn, who's originally from New Hampshire. He's an outsider. He's not part of the Massachusetts elite, but after the American Revolution, he settles along the Kennebec River in Maine, and he becomes a congressman. And while he's in Congress, he bumps into Thomas Jefferson, and he aligns himself with the Virginians, which is essentially unforgivable in Boston. And his apostasy is complete when he does something unimaginable. He transfers his son from Williams College to the College of William and Mary. Oh boy. And so, you know, what are the things that excite Henry Dearborn besides wealthy widows? And we'll get into that in a second. Democratic ideals, religious pluralism, less obsession with property rights, more emphasis on democratic values like voting rights. And he has collected very quickly disciples, such as a wealthy self-made man in Maine, a guy by the name of William King. And King is a man on the make. And everybody who bumps into King recognizes this is a guy who wants to be the first governor of an independent state of Maine. And he does so in a very clever but very disingenuous way by aligning himself politically with Maine's squatters. And there are a lot of these squatters, and they have lots of children. So it's a growing demographic, and he will essentially tell them anything. I mean, it's hard to think a politician doing this in order to, get what he wants. And he not only gets laws passed that help out the squatters, but he also advocates for religious pluralism. That is to say, he gets settlers off the hook for having to pay taxes to the Congregational Church as well as to what, probably their Baptist church that they actually went to. And interestingly, what in the process of writing this book, I discovered in Maine, this is referred to as the Toleration Act. You won't find this act on the books in Massachusetts, where it's invariably referred to as the Religious Freedom Act. And I don't know why that split occurred. Okay, so Maine isn't happy with the Massachusetts ideal, but there are Massachusetts loyalists, as it were, in Maine. And I'll give you an example of one, a guy by the name of Alden Bradford. He is a representative of the Massachusetts ideal in Maine. He is a Federalist, as were the great and the good in Massachusetts. with a name like Alden Bradford, you're not surprised to learn he had deep Mayflower roots. He graduated from Harvard College. He was a Congregationalist minister at Wiscasset, Maine, and one of the founders of Lincoln Academy. And the stated ideals of Lincoln Academy when it was created in 1801 was to raise up useful citizens for the Commonwealth. Well, I'm a graduate of Lincoln Academy, and I'm not sure I'm such a good citizen for the Commonwealth. He's also a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Very dubious, that. And he's interesting in that New England is a little bit different because he does have status, but he does not have wealth. You know, he's a minister, that gives him status. He went to Harvard, but he's not a wealthy man. Far from it. He writes a zillion books, and one definitely gets the impression he's just pumping these things out to feed the many kids, right? He has a political career. He actually resigns his pulpit ostensibly for health reasons. He becomes a town clerk in Wiscasset. He becomes a Wiscasset selectman. And he gets displaced in 1811 when the Jeffersonian Elbridge Gerry gets reelected as governor. And he basically sweeps all the Federalists out of office. This is a big moment. This is, well, you probably know about the gerrymander, right? And gerrymandering, right? It's a Massachusetts product. You should all be proud. So Bradford gets swept out of office by order of Elbridge Gerry, and he writes this prolix protest in Federalist newspapers, you know, a whole broadsheet, you know, sort of whinging about this event. And he's a victim. However, the next year, the next gubernatorial election, the Federalists sweep into office, sort of a surprise, and they reward Alden Bradford for his political allegiance by making him the Secretary of State of Massachusetts. Oh, that's a pretty good boost up from being the selectman in Wiscasset, Maine. And in fact, he will remain the Secretary of State of Massachusetts for, I think, 12 years. So he may be the longest serving Secretary of State, at least after the Revolution. He's a little nutty. He tries to transfer documents from the State House to the Massachusetts Historical Society. The General Court objects, and the sort of shamefaced the society has to hand the documents back. But Bradford is important because he's an apologist and biographer of Governor Caleb Strong, who was a Federalist governor during the War of 1812. And this Caleb Strong is a Federalist and all about states' rights. This is a time in American history where the center of American secessionist thought is not Charleston, South Carolina, believe it or not, it's Boston, Massachusetts. And Massachusetts keeps on threatening to take the ball and go home if the federal government doesn't do what it wants. And Caleb Strong objects so strongly to the War of 1812 that, you know, he promotes this idea of a Hartford Convention. And there's a lot of fear that this Hartford Convention is going to result in New England seceding from the Union. And it's a very bad moment in American history. What we also know, and you'll see in my book, is that Governor Strong, through an emissary from Ellsworth, Maine, was communicating with the British governor and general in Nova Scotia. And he wasn't asking for British troops. He was saying, look, if we split off from the United States, I don't want redcoats in Boston. I do want weapons, though. And the British are, sure. The downside to this is what? So Caleb Strong, a very troubling figure. By the way, his counsel's papers have sort of disappeared from the Commonwealth's archives. So it's hard to get this stuff from the American side, but the British have wonderful archives. if you dig deep enough into it, you can find all that stuff. So after the war, Caleb Strong remains governor for a while. You get other Federalists. Alden Bradford writes a really mediocre history of Massachusetts, but he is going to be very influential in reshaping how Massachusetts thinks about itself. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the War of 1812, because you could get really lost in the weeds, but following the war, Massachusetts was essentially a pariah state after the Hartford Convention. It was a real debacle for Massachusetts because it looked as treasonous as it was. Furthermore, there'd been failure of the Massachusetts militia. There was heavy debt. Those troublesome people in Maine were agitating for statehood. Things aren't going well until, and I think this is probably instructional in 2023, until you had a president who had a real knack for talking to people. And that's James Monroe. And he does something presidents had not done before. He starts traveling to New England. And people are completely blown away and delighted. And Boston Federalist newspaper editors coined this phrase, very unlikely, just a few short years before, the era of good feelings. These crusty old Federalists are totally swept away by James Monroe, who's not the most brilliant of the founders, but he's not an egghead like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, but he knows how to talk to people. And one of my favorite anecdotes is a classmate of John Adams from Harvard, a guy named David Sewell, who was a federal judge in Maine. Somehow President Madison ends up having breakfast at his house somewhere in York County. And this crusty old man is so flattered by this that even as Monroe is having breakfast in his own home, he won't sit the entire time. He's so honored by the president of the chief magistrate of the United States. Okay, so Monroe charms. It'd be nice to have a president who could charm these days, right? So by 1815, as the Commonwealth was facing a crisis in confidence, the Hartford Convention had discredited the Massachusetts ideal. Its vaunted militia had been revealed as a paper tiger, and its political influence waned as the number of Western and Southern congressmen increased. And for the last 20 years, Massachusetts had been opposing new states coming into the Union, because with every new state that came into the Union, Massachusetts became less important. Okay? So how does Massachusetts reassert its leadership? Because let me suggest that Massachusetts is not content to let other states lead in the country. So I think it's actually Peter Gomez, who used to be affiliated with this institution, who talks about Massachusetts drawing on its intellectual and moral capital, presenting itself as not only the future of the American Republic, but actually as the very essence of the American historical experience. So Daniel Webster and the founders of the Pilgrim Society, such as Alden Bradford, stumbled into this new approach to American exceptionalism. Webster gave a speech on the 200th anniversary of the 1620 landing at Plymouth Rock, in which he made the case that New England no longer held itself distinct from the rest of the United States. Instead, Massachusetts, through the Pilgrims, not the Puritans, the Pilgrims, represented the nation's actual foundation and its way forward. But Webster warned that there was a stain on the nation: slavery. He called on all to, and I quote, "pledge ourselves here upon the rock of Plymouth to extirpate and destroy it. It is not fit that the land of the Pilgrims should bear the shame longer." Oh, Massachusetts has a new idea about itself. And that idea happens the very same year that Maine becomes a state. I don't think it's a coincidence. So Massachusetts sort of relentlessly built a mythology of historical preeminence from the Pilgrims to Bunker Hill and mined its past to provide ammunition for its new role as a moral beacon, such as rediscovering John Winthrop's sermon as a city on a hill in the 1820s. It had been lost, forgotten, but it gets seized upon. Or you get Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the Maine-born son of a representative to the Hartford Convention, who contributes to this myth making with his poem Paul Revere's Ride, or essentially all of his historical poems. Arguably, the peak of Massachusetts' assumption as the nation's historical and moral leader was in 1863, when Abraham Lincoln, descendant of Mayflower people, declared Thanksgiving a national holiday. Coincidentally, the same year the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Massachusetts had arrived as the leading moral force in the nation. And I think that Maine statehood offered Massachusetts an opportunity to reinvent itself. Commencing with the 1820 Constitutional Convention, so when Maine leaves Massachusetts, the 1780 Constitution, which included all these counties in Maine, has to be rethought. And John Adams refuses to participate, by the way. So with this Constitutional Convention, the Commonwealth began tearing apart the old Massachusetts ideal. For example, the revisions permit Boston to incorporate as a city. And Henry Dearborn, still influential, but loathed by Federalists all the more because he married a wealthy Boston widow, convinced the convention's delegates to abandon senatorial apportionment by wealth. And other things start to fall away. By 1833, Massachusetts gives up on state-supported religion. In the 1840s, it gives up on mandatory militia drill. Massachusetts is moving forward. But what about Maine? Well, our friend John Adams worried that William King, our populist friend, was a problem. And he called William King a bold, daring, ardent genius with talents capable of inspiring the people with his own enthusiasm and ambition. And that King would, quote, tear off Maine from old Massachusetts and leave her in a state below mediocrity in the Union. And I don't know if he means Maine is mediocre or Massachusetts, or maybe both. It isn't clear. But what I do know is that after Maine's statehood, he likes to write to Judge David Sewell up in York County, and they were classmates at Harvard, and they're just being old men grumbling about stuff. It's really kind of fun, but he sneers about Maine's statehood. However ardent they were for the separation, now when they have so peaceably obtained it, they seem to care little about it and perhaps even regret it. So Adams not a fan of Maine statehood by any means. So, but ultimately, Maine did not become populous and wealthy as the proponents of statehood, like William King, predicted, nor was the cost of government reduced. And in fact, very few problems were solved. And I think this is true with a lot of statehood movements. You get a lot of promises by men on the make. Hey, if you just vote for me, everything's going to be fine. Well, so unlike Massachusetts, Maine did not industrialize to any considerable degree before the Civil War. Despite its admirable state motto, "Dirigo, I lead," Maine was not much of a leader. With one curious exception, it founds the American pacifist movement, oddly enough. But other than that, great things tend not to come out of Maine. In general terms, it was an underpopulated frontier, much like the Western states, with an economy based on agricultural and resource extraction, primarily timbering and fishing, which were augmented by the coasting trade and shipbuilding. Politically, it remained very much a New England state, with town meetings dominating the political calendar. Culturally and politically, it continued to look to Boston for cues, retaining a love-hate relationship with a regional metropolis. Think, go Red Sox, damn summer people. I don't know how to square that circle. So William King, who'd endeavored for many years to gain Maine statehood, appropriately became its first governor. Ironically, he only lasted about 14 months on the job because he attempted to sponsor some very Massachusetts-like legislation in Maine that would promote manufacturing. Maine's Jeffersonian farmers, small government people, would have none of it. The legislature balked, and King resigned 14 months after 20 years of working for statehood. So not much of a career as governor, but I think that's the case with a lot of rebels when it comes to the hard business of governing. It's not nearly as interesting as rising up against the system. So the ambiguity of the new state's relationship is demonstrated in its capital. Maine chose Augusta, by the way, named after Henry Dearborn's daughter, as a central location, easily accessed by all. And this is in contrast to Boston, which, stays the state capital. It always was, and as far as I know, it always will be. I'll try to mention that to people in Worcester someday. However, Maine's new Capitol building, while constructed of local granite, was designed by the Boston architect Charles Bulfinch and closely modeled after the Massachusetts State House. So it's sort of a halfway rebellion. They don't really strike their own identity. And there are other elements that are sort of show a halfway Maine identity as well. For example, Maine's the only other state that celebrates Patriots' Day in April, or that in 1823, 3 years after statehood, they set up the Maine Historical Society. So Maine is sort of aping Massachusetts, even though it strove for independence, which I find interesting. So in conclusion, Maine's statehood was a crucial parting for Massachusetts, providing an opportunity for the Commonwealth to reinvent itself. However, it was arguably less transformative for Maine, which did not cleave a bold new course for itself. And I would argue it was the events of the War of 1812 that set both states on these trajectories. I thank you for listening to me and my odd sense of humor. And if you have any questions, I think we can take questions, Gavin, is that right?
So Maine became a state as part of the Missouri Compromise. Can you talk a little bit about, do you think it would have become a state at that point without the Missouri Compromise, without this grand settlement between the slave and non-slave states, or would it have happened later or not at all?
So great question for starters. So statehood happens after there is a vote in Maine, which finally in 1819 says we want, the majority of people in Maine say we want to become an independent state. And the General Court of Massachusetts is not interested in fighting that at all and says, fine, if Congress approves this by a certain date in 1820, then you're an independent state. Washes its hands. So it goes to Congress, and there's an expectation that is going to breeze through Congress. After all, it's going to be a new state. It's going to be Jeffersonian. That should go over well in Congress. And then things go awry, as things often do in Congress, and somebody linked Maine's statehood to Missouri's statehood. Missouri, the idea being that it a lot of people think it should enter as a slave state. This sets Maine's political leaders, Jeffersonians, in a panic, and not to their credit either, because some of them are clearly quite willing to allow slavery in Missouri if that allows them to assume state office in this new state of Maine. And it's a pretty ugly dynamic, actually. So Maine was all set to become a state. Missouri Compromise shows up at the last minute. I think within hours of the deadline set by the Massachusetts legislature for Maine to become state, the Congress finally comes through with the Missouri Compromise, which leaves very few people happy, including the country's leading leading Federalist, who is Rufus King, who had helped set up the Constitution of 1780 here in Massachusetts, but then had done what a lot of New England boys do. They figure out that you get a lot more money in New York. I'm one of them. And he goes there. But Rufus King is also William King's stepbrother. And Rufus King really does not like slavery. And if Federalists have one thing going for them, they do not like slavery. And he's very upset that these sort of backwoods politicians in Maine are willing to sell out, enslaved peoples just in order to get their state. So sort of a sordid tale, I'm sorry to say. Other questions?
Could you talk about how the Maine becoming a state changed politics within Massachusetts? It sort of removed this sort of populace, northern, but actually Western in sensibility, frontier part of the state?
Sure. So old Massachusetts was largely Federalist, and the District of Maine was largely Jeffersonian. And the problem is that the Jeffersonian Party in old Massachusetts is dying. In fact, it effectively is dead with the death of Elbridge Gerry in 1814, who was Vice President of the United States when he died. And there are no real Jeffersonian leaders left in old Massachusetts. All the Jeffersonian leadership is in Maine. And the Jeffersonians in Massachusetts hate this. And in one of these bizarre cases of, I don't know, human complexity, the Jeffersonians in old Massachusetts decide it's better to have a Federalist government than to let people in Maine tell them what to do. And I think that would happen today too. So it's a very funny dynamic. And actually, Massachusetts Federalists have this funny idea. Okay, Maine is clearly Jeffersonian. We pretty much lost it. Old Massachusetts is Federalist. If we eject Maine, we can keep old Massachusetts Federalist forever. How many Federalists in the room? Okay, no, it lasted 4 years. And then a Jeffersonian does become governor in Massachusetts. So yeah, there's some very interesting dynamics in politics in Massachusetts. And oh yeah, Massachusetts gets Henry Dearborn back and his wealthy widow. Good on you. You can have them.
We have a question online from Joseph, who asks, why was the new state given the name Maine?
Well, so there was a debate about what to call the new state. And there's why Maine is called Maine is sort of lost in the mists of time. I think that the general assumption is that it's named after the ancient province in France, which no longer exists. So it was referred to as Maine for a long time. And after the Constitution is approved, it becomes known as the District of Maine because it has its own federal district court system separate from that of Massachusetts. And then statehood comes along and people are like, well, do we really want to call this Maine? And some people come up with this weird word, Lagonia. And it never really flies. And as a guy named Josh Smith, I'm going to say there's something to be said for monosyllabic. So that's my take. But you can read lots of books about that, Joseph. Yes, ma'am.
The recent politician in Maine history, King, governor?
Yes.
Something?
related to the first one?
No, I think he's from away, as they say, but I think he went to Bowdoin. There are a lot of kings around, but he's not a Maine king. I don't think. Well, he is now. But. Next question.
Yeah. How was the border drawn? Like, how did they know where to draw this border?
Lively imagination, largely. So the northeastern boundary with Quebec in the northern part of the province of New Brunswick gets figured out largely after an event called the Aroostook War, where essentially Maine loggers and Canadian loggers disputed about where these trees were, and so it had to get figured out. And both New Brunswick and Maine marched their militia up into Aroostook County and sort of growl at each other. And neither the British imperial government nor the US government in Washington is anxious to have this war. So they send high-ranking generals up there, say, look, boys, back down. And they do, and a rational negotiation process gets worked out. It's a little more complicated down in Passamaquoddy Bay, but it's actually parts of the boundary are still under dispute up there. So including an island that the Canadians claim, as does the US. Canadians built a lighthouse on it. And sometimes people from Machias come out in a lobster boat and put an American flag on it. So, waters are fluid, right?
We have another question online from Matthew, who is interested in the role of Maine statehood in the history of the lumber industry, which exploded shortly after statehood, and wondering if you could speak to that.
So I'm no expert in the lumber industry. It's certainly always been a big thing in Maine, starting with pine and then later going on to spruce timber, and you get Bangor and other big lumbering cities. I'm largely going to plead ignorance on this. I'm not an environmental historian. There are guys like Richard Judd up at the University of Maine, probably retired by now, who studied this stuff a lot more than I have. So I'm sorry, I don't have a really good answer for that.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank our speaker this evening, and we have books for sale on the landing. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined us online, and I hope that they will purchase a copy of the book through their favorite online retailer. Thank you.